The brain image used as this course logo is easily recognizable as a human brain, although this is a simplified artist rendition. The actual human brain is a little messier and looks like this. A huge amount of the human brain is devoted to the cerebral cortex, which is the mesoworms that covers most of the brain. Upon first glance, it doesn't appear to have much in the way of organization, especially if you compare it to a street map of Edmonton. There doesn't appear to be a lot of urban planning going on here in the cortex. However, the cortex has been mapped and described in astonishing detail. At this point, the picture is still far from complete. However, neuroscientists continue to piece it together. For this tricky topic, we will consider the arrangement of structures and connections in the cortex. Before diving into the arrangement of the cortex, it is first helpful to consider where this human brain of ours comes from. Some evidence for the origins of the human brain comes from comparisons of our brains with those of our early ancestors. The brain on the far left shows the approximate size and form of the brain of Australopithecus afarensis, a species that lived in Africa about 3 to 4 million years ago. The most famous member of this species is Lucy, a female whose remarkably intact remains survived until discovery in 1974. She had a brain about 1/3 the size of the modern human, shown on the far right. If we fast forward in time through our other early relatives, we can see that the overall brain size has grown over the course of the last 4 million years or so. Homo erectus, shown here, which hung around on Earth for a whopping 1.5 million years, had a brain capacity much larger than that of Lucy. And the more modern Homo neanderthalis, the species that most people think about when they picture cavemen, had a very large brain. Neanderthal skulls have a ridged flat forehead shown here, which is represented in this artist's model in this picture. The back of the skull, which is not visible in the model, is thought to have housed a lot of brain matter. The brains of modern humans are actually thought to be a little bit smaller than those of Neanderthals, but a modern human can also grow a wicked beard. Modern humans also shave their beards, wear clothing with zippers, and snuggle their cats. What is it about the human brain that has resulted in such weird and wonderful behavior? Now we can also compare the human brain to those brains of other living species. Note that the rat brain on the far left appears smooth, whereas most of the visible brain of cats, chimpanzees, and humans are more folded and wrinkly. Note also that there are some key differences between primate brains, those of humans and chimps, compared to other mammals, in that they have proportionally much more cortex. Also note that the cerebellum of the cat and rat, shown here, take up a fairly large proportion of the total brain compared to that of the two primates. So let's take a peek inside the brain. Using location and function of particular brain regions as a guide, neuroscientists have been able to piece together an overall organization of the brain. This organization roughly divides the brain into 3 main regions: the hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain, shown here. This is shown color-coded in this cross-section of a human brain. Clearly, most of the brain is forebrain, and most of that is cortex. So here are some interesting facts about the cortex. Just a little hint here, these make excellent exam questions. First of all, the word cortex comes from the word which means bark or covering in Latin, like the bark of a tree. It makes up about 80% of the human brain, and as I've already mentioned and shown you, it's highly folded. There are 2 hemispheres, left and right, and 4 lobes in each hemisphere. The cortex, quite broadly, is involved in complex functions, things like thought, planning, perception, and consciousness. In each hemisphere, there are 4 lobes conveniently color-coded in this diagram. At the very front is the aptly named frontal lobe. Behind it, the parietal lobe. In the back, the occipital lobe. And near the temple, resembling the thumb of a boxing glove, is the temporal lobe. A real brain looks more like this, although it's not color-coded, and even though it's not nicely laid out like the diagram is, you can still distinguish the different lobes that I just described. Now, in addition to these anatomical divisions are the functional divisions. There are three main functional divisions in the cortex. Primary sensory areas exist for each of our senses. They are the first bit of cortex that receives incoming information from the sensory organs, like the eyes, ears, skin, and so on, by way of the thalamus, which sort of acts like a switchboard. These primary sensory areas are important in the first steps in conscious perception, categorizing and integrating sensory information. As you read in the textbook, they are located in various regions of the cortex. The primary motor area is a strip of cortex at the posterior or back end of the frontal lobe. It receives information from surrounding areas and initiates a motor plan for voluntary movement by communicating with motor neurons in the brainstem and spinal cord. Association cortex, which makes up most of the cortical volume, has a less well-defined job description. It's involved mainly in integrating information gathered from other areas in the cortex, as well as some subcortical structures, and it's involved with more complex thought processes such as perception and decision-making. Unlike the primary sensory and motor areas, stimulation of the association cortex does not produce any movement or sensation. For this reason, it is sometimes referred to as silent cortex. Some medical procedures have allowed neurosurgeons to take a really intimate peek inside the brain. One of the first instances of this was in the 1860s, when German physiologist Edward Hitzig made observations of wounded soldiers and revealed that stimulating particular parts of the brain resulted in movement in specific locations in the body. Almost 100 years later, scientist and surgeon Wilder Penfield made incredibly detailed observations from awake, locally anesthetized patients undergoing surgery for epilepsy. This image here shows the brain of one of Penfield's patients, a boy who had part of his brain removed to treat severe epilepsy. The small numbers indicate areas where neurons were tickled with mild electric current. The patient would then report their sensations and movements, which were recorded and mapped. These cartoons are representations that summarize the maps of the body as represented in the primary motor cortex on the left and the primary somatosensory cortex on the right, responsible for the sense of touch. Notice that these same parts of the body are represented in the cortex in the same arrangement as they appear in the actual body, the feet at one end and the head at the other. Something else to notice is that the amount of brain devoted to the head and hands in both of these maps are huge and proportionally larger than the actual body size of these particular areas. Therefore, the amount of brain devoted to a body part depends upon its function and not its size. Note that there are some organs, such as the teeth and genitals, that have representation in the somatosensory map, but not in the motor map. In other words, these areas have extreme touch sensitivity, but there's not much in the way of motor control for these body parts. Another way that scientists learn about functions of the cortex is by making observations of people who have sustained some sort of damage, usually through disease or injury. The figure above outlines what happened to 25-year-old Phineas Gage, an American railroad construction foreman who suffered an accident in 1848. This accident was unusual in that it was pretty severe, but he survived. So he took a tamping iron, which is used to compact explosives into holes drilled in rock, and his job was to tamp down the explosives. However, this unfortunate day he set off a spark and detonated the explosive and sent the tamping iron through his head, as indicated here in the figure. Not surprisingly, he sustained extensive damage to his frontal lobes. After he recovered from infections associated with his injury, he was relatively unaffected by the injury in a physical way, but reports indicate that his personality changed and he became impulsive, impatient, and disrespectful, using profanity, which was uncharacteristic of him before the accident. His employment was terminated by the railroad because they felt he could no longer perform his duties after the accident. This was one of the earliest documented instances of personality change as a result of injury, and since then research has pointed to the frontal cortex, especially the prefrontal cortex, as being particularly important in planning and impulse control. With these early attempts, as well as more modern and less invasive techniques such as neuroimaging, scientists have been able to localize certain functional areas of the cortex to particular anatomical locations. As we learned from the story of Phineas Gage, the frontal lobe is involved in attention, planning, and impulse control, and has a large role in voluntary movement since it houses the primary motor area. The parietal lobe is involved in the sensation and perception of touch, since it houses the primary somatosensory area. The temporal lobe has a strong role in hearing, and it is the location of the primary auditory cortex, which is the first bit of cortex which receives information about sounds from the outside environment. The occipital lobe in the back is strongly tied to vision and houses the primary visual cortex. So there you have it.